Hello, my name is Greg Brunk from BlackRock, here to provide you with an update on the B+RVUSA fund. As you know, this is a fund that invests in large cap U.S. equities, and when we look at the equity market, at the time of this taping, the S&P 500 was up over 14% year to date, which is causing some people to ask, have the returns been already gotten out of the market? Will the market go higher? And what I like to point out is when I look at the S&P 500 today, well, it's about 4% off its all-time high set earlier this year. It's only about 4% higher than the levels we saw back in 2007. And when you look at the earnings, though, on the S&P 500, while the market's up a mere 4% from 2007 highs, earnings are up over 26% over those levels. So this whole move that we've seen in the market has largely been driven on the backs of corporate earnings and U.S. companies out there generating earnings, generating profits, and generating results for their shareholders. So when I look at the markets on a going forward basis, I would argue that while valuations aren't as cheap as they were 12 to 18 months ago, they're clearly cheap relative to fixed income. And as I look forward and I see how can the market go higher, I think like it has over the last 5 or 6 years, it can go higher on the backs of corporate earnings. And one of the biggest drivers is obviously the U.S. economy. And when I look at the U.S. economy relative to the rest of the world, I see a lot of positive things happening. When I look at housing, which kind of got us into the big mess back in the recession, housing is clearly starting to improve in the United States. Whether you look at average home prices, whether you look at new housing starts or existing home sales, all are trending higher. That's a positive for the U.S. I also look at manufacturing, where we're seeing somewhat of a renaissance in manufacturing in North America, not only in the U.S., but also in Mexico, as companies are starting to relocate their manufacturing capabilities from Asia back to North America. One of the biggest drivers is we have a very cheap source of energy, and that is natural gas, with all the oil and gas plays throughout North America, which is making it more cost effective to bring manufacturing back. So when I look at housing, manufacturing, I also throw in the U.S. consumer doing much better than they were back in 2007. All big positives for the U.S. and I think will help the U.S. market move higher as we go forward. And the last thing I would talk about is the fiscal situation in the U.S. When you look at the U.S. government, and a lot of talk was around the U.S. government's fiscal situation towards the end of 2012 as we were dealing with the fiscal cliff, but it has gotten much, much better. In fact, when we look at the U.S. budget deficit, we're currently on pace to have a budget deficit of less than 3% of our GDP by 2014. That is a huge change on where it's been over the last couple of years. And also, getting back to the fiscal cliff, I would point out more over the short term that a lot of those tax increases and mandatory spending cuts were all front-end loaded. So it's clearly provided a headwind for the U.S. economy. But the positive is the worst of that headwind is behind us in the second and third quarter of this year. And in fact, over the next 5 quarters, that fiscal headwind of tax increases and spending cuts starts to go away and starts to reduce. That leads us to believe that you could see the U.S. economy actually reaccelerate towards the end of 2013 and 2014, again giving us a catalyst to drive the equity market higher. So just to wrap up, kind of shifting from the fund or to the markets to the fund, when we look at this fund, in order to capitalize on the opportunities out there, we're overweight the U.S. financials, clearly give us exposure to the U.S. and benefit from the U.S. recovery. They're also experiencing, accelerating revenues, and they're also being very diligent on the cost structure, driving earnings higher. So we own companies in this portfolio like JP Morgan, Citibank, U.S. Bancorp to get us exposure into the U.S. financials. We also own an overweight on information technology. When we look at the technology infrastructure in America today, the average life is around 4 years. That's almost double what it historically is. So we think we could see a reacceleration of enterprise spending in the technology space, propelling these stocks higher. We own companies like Google in the mobility space, like Microsoft in the software space, to give us exposure to that segment. And the final area of overweight or exposure we have to the portfolio is in the healthcare arena, where we own some of the large cap U.S. healthcare companies like Merck, like Amgen, that give us exposure to that more defensive area of the marketplace. So overall, when we look at kind of where we go from here, we like what we're seeing in the U.S. economy. We think it can continue to drive earnings higher in U.S. companies, and we've positioned our portfolio to benefit from those results as we go forward.